My name is Irene Beaumont, and what I'm about to tell you is the reason I no longer answer to Mom. Stay with me until the end, because the day my daughter thought she'd won was the day she lost everything, and I was the one holding the door open for her on the way out. I spent 34 years building Beaumont Home Health, a private care agency out of Burlington, Ontario. I started it at my kitchen table in 1989 with a second-hand fax machine and a list of 12 clients. By the time I was 62, we had 4 offices across southern Ontario: Burlington, Hamilton, Mississauga, and one we'd just opened in Kingston, with over 240 employees. We provided in-home nursing, personal support workers, and palliative care coordination. It wasn't glamorous work. It was hard, quiet, necessary work, and I loved every single part of it. My husband passed in 2014, lung cancer. He was gone in 4 months from diagnosis to funeral, which is its own kind of cruelty. After that, I threw myself even deeper into the business. Not because I was avoiding grief, though maybe some of that too, but because the business was the thing we'd built together, and keeping it going felt like the most honest way I knew to honor him. I have 2 children. My son lives in Vancouver. We're close in the way that distance allows. Phone calls on Sundays, visits at Christmas, no drama. He has his own life, and he respects mine. My daughter is a different story. She's 41 now. She married young, divorced young, and then, in her mid-30s, she met a man I'll call her husband. I'll tell you his name in a moment. But first I need you to understand who my daughter was before he came into her life, because I think about that version of her often. She was funny, stubborn in a way that used to make me proud. She had opinions about everything, and she wasn't afraid of anyone. I used to say she got that from me. When she brought him home for the first time, I remember thinking he was charming in a way that required effort, like someone who'd practiced being likable. His name was Curtis. Curtis Webb. He worked in real estate development, which in his case meant he moved money around in ways that were hard to track and always involved other people's risk. He drove a new truck every 2 years and had very strong opinions about wine for a man who hadn't grown up with any. My daughter looked at him like he'd solved something she'd been trying to figure out her whole life. They got married in September of 2019, small ceremony up near Collingwood. I paid for the wedding. I mentioned that not out of bitterness. At the time, I gave it gladly, but because it matters later. The shift happened slowly, the way these things do. By the end of their first year of marriage, my daughter had stopped calling on Sundays. She started canceling dinners. When we did see each other, Curtis was always there, and the conversations started to have a shape to them. Questions about the business that didn't feel like curiosity. They felt like inventory. How much is the Kingston office turning over? Have you thought about selling? What does your succession plan look like? I told myself he was just making conversation. I told myself a lot of things. In January of 2021, my daughter came to me alone. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd started the business. And she said she was worried about me. She said the stress of running the company at my age was too much. She said she'd been doing some research. She used that word, research. And she thought it might be time to think about stepping back. I told her I was 65 years old and in perfectly good health, and I would decide when it was time to step back. She left without finishing her coffee. 3 months later, I got a call from my accountant. He told me he'd received a letter from a law firm in Toronto requesting financial records on behalf of a family member concerned about potential cognitive decline and financial mismanagement. I asked him to read the name on the letter. It was my daughter's name. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. I kept waiting to feel something other than a cold, flat understanding, because I knew right then what was happening. I just didn't know yet how far they'd taken it. The application was filed under the Substitute Decisions Act. In Ontario, if someone can convince a court that you lack the capacity to manage your own property, they can be appointed as your guardian. The process is supposed to protect vulnerable people, and it can. But it can also be used as a weapon by someone who knows how to frame things. The affidavit my daughter filed said I had shown signs of memory loss and confusion at family gatherings. It said I had made several large financial decisions without consulting anyone. It said that employees had raised concerns. She used the word employees, plural, with no names, about my judgment. Every single statement was either a fabrication or a distortion of something real, twisted just enough to be unrecognizable. The large financial decision she referenced was a $180,000 equipment upgrade I'd authorized for our Hamilton office, a decision I'd discussed at length with my operations manager and our board of 3 directors. The memory confusion she described was me forgetting once, at her birthday dinner, whether her friend's new baby was a boy or a girl. I had met the baby one time. What I didn't fully understand yet was that Curtis had spent 6 months cultivating a relationship with a lawyer named, and I want to be precise here, Bernard Lacroix. Lacroix had a small practice in Oakville, and a history I would later learn involved 2 prior complaints to the Law Society of Ontario. He was the one who drafted the affidavit. He was the one who recommended a specific assessor for the capacity evaluation. He was the one who had, I would eventually find out, referred Curtis to a financial advisor who stood to manage a significant portion of my assets if guardianship was granted. The capacity assessment took place in April of 2021. I was told it was a standard evaluation, that I should answer honestly and not overthink it. I did. I knew who the Prime Minister was. I knew what year it was. I knew my address and my children's birthdays and the current structure of my company's operating expenses. But the assessor, a man I'd never met, referred by Lacroix, wrote in his report that I demonstrated notable difficulty with executive function tasks and showed some evidence of disinhibited communication. I am a direct woman. I have always been a direct woman. Apparently that read as a symptom. The guardianship application was heard by a judge in June of 2021. My son flew in from Vancouver. He stood outside the courtroom with me and held my hand and told me it would be fine. It was not fine. The judge granted interim guardianship of my property to my daughter, pending a full hearing. My accounts were frozen. My signing authority at Beaumont Home Health was suspended. I need you to understand what that meant practically. I could not access my personal bank accounts. I could not make payroll decisions. I could not sign contracts. I was still physically present in my offices, still showing up every morning, but I had been legally stripped of the ability to run the company I had built for 34 years. I had to request money from my daughter for groceries. She gave me a weekly allowance of $300. $300. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A woman who had built a multi-million-dollar business, standing in a Fortino's with a debit card that had someone else's name on the account. Why didn't I hire a good lawyer immediately? I know that's what you're thinking, because it's the logical question. Here is what actually happened. The day the accounts were frozen, I called 3 family lawyers in Burlington. The first 2 told me this was outside their area of practice. The third one referred me to an estates and capacity litigator in Toronto named Paula. Paula was excellent. Paula quoted me a retainer of $25,000. My personal accounts were frozen and I had $300 a week. I had assets worth considerably more than $25,000, but I could not touch them. I called my son and asked him to help cover the retainer. He did, eventually. It took time to move money across provinces, but in the meantime, I had a duty counsel lawyer at the initial hearing who'd had my file for 40 minutes before we walked in. That is why. That is exactly why. It's not a plot hole. It's what happens to people when the system moves faster than they can respond to it. Paula came on fully in August of 2021, and that is when things began very slowly to turn. The first thing Paula did was file for an independent capacity assessment, not one referred by the opposing counsel's network, one chosen by us, conducted by a geriatric specialist at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton. I went through 4 hours of testing. The report came back in October. I was found to have full capacity in all assessed domains, no evidence of cognitive impairment, no executive function deficits. The assessor noted in her report that she found my communication style direct and precise, which she considered consistent with someone who had managed a complex organization for decades. The second thing Paula did was start pulling on threads. Bernard Lacroix's referral to the assessor turned out to be documented in an email chain. The email chain showed that Lacroix had communicated with the assessor prior to my evaluation, not to discuss logistics but to share background context on my situation. That is not how capacity assessments are supposed to work. The assessor is supposed to be independent. That email chain became very important. The financial advisor, Curtis, had been meeting with a man named, and I will use his name because it is part of the record now, Gerald Fontenot, had drafted a preliminary asset management proposal for my portfolio before the guardianship application was even filed. Paula found this through a disclosure request. The proposal was dated 3 weeks before my daughter first came to me with her concerns about my health. 3 weeks before. They had planned this. They had planned this before they sat across from me at my kitchen table pretending to be worried. I want to tell you about the months between August 2021 and the final hearing in March 2022. Because they were the hardest months of my life, and I don't want to rush past them like they were just background to the legal story. My daughter and I did not speak unless it was through lawyers. She controlled my money. She had business cards printed, I was told, by one of my employees, with the title Acting Director, Beaumont Home Health. She used them. She attended a supplier meeting in Hamilton in November and introduced herself to people who had worked alongside me for 15 years. She redecorated my office. She moved my desk. I kept going in every morning. I had no legal authority, but I still had the relationships, and the people who worked for me, most of them still knew whose company it was. My operations manager, a woman who had been with me for 11 years, quietly kept me copied on internal communications even though she wasn't supposed to. My accountant, who had been with me since 1994, continued to prepare reports for me personally while formally submitting to my daughter's oversight. These people kept me tethered. I don't have the words for what that meant. I did not ask my daughter to stop. I did not beg. I did not send long emotional messages through lawyers. I did everything Paula told me to do, and I waited. The full hearing was scheduled for March 15, 2022. 3 weeks before, Paula filed a motion to introduce the Lacroix email chain and the Fontenot proposal as evidence of coordinated bad faith. The judge allowed it. Curtis, it turned out, had underestimated a few things. He had underestimated Paula. He had underestimated my accountant, who, when subpoenaed, told the truth in precise and devastating detail. And he had underestimated the fact that I had, quietly, over the course of those 8 months, kept a record of everything. Every conversation I could remember, dated and written out by hand in a notebook. Every interaction my daughter had with staff that was reported back to me. Every piece of paper I could legally access. It was sitting in a box in my son's car in the parking lot of the courthouse on March 15th. The hearing lasted 2 days. The independent capacity report from St. Joseph's was entered into evidence. The email chain was entered into evidence. The Fontenot proposal was entered into evidence. My accountant testified. My operations manager testified. My son testified. Bernard Lacroix was not present. He had withdrawn from the case in January, citing a conflict of interest. On March 17, 2022, the judge vacated the interim guardianship order. Full capacity confirmed. Financial accounts unfrozen. Signing authority restored. I walked out of that courthouse at 4:15 in the afternoon, and my son was waiting on the front steps with 2 cups of Tim Hortons coffee, and we stood there in the March cold, and I cried for the first time in 8 months. Not from relief, from something more complicated than that. I was already thinking about what came next. Because I wasn't finished. Paula filed a civil claim for damages in April 2022, abusive process, fraudulent misrepresentation to the court, financial harm resulting from the wrongful suspension of my business authority. The claim named my daughter Curtis, Bernard Lacroix, and Gerald Fontenot. The Law Society of Ontario received a formal complaint about Lacroix, which I understand is still under review. Curtis's real estate development company, which, it emerged during discovery, had been partially funded through a series of loans that were structured to look like my personal gifts, became the subject of a separate CRA audit after my accountant flagged the documentation. My daughter called me in August of 2022. It was the first time we'd spoken in over a year. She said she was sorry. She said Curtis had pushed her into it, that she hadn't realized how far it would go, that she had been scared to stop once it started. I listened. I listened to everything she said, and then I told her I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet, and I hung up. That might sound cold. I know it might sound cold, but I had spent 8 months watching her attend meetings in my place, sign documents with my company's name, and receive a weekly report on my finances, like she'd earned the right to that information. Sorry doesn't rebuild a desk someone moved. Sorry doesn't unprint business cards. I am not a woman who performs forgiveness because it's expected of me. The civil claim settled in February of 2023. I cannot share the specific terms. What I can tell you is that I have my company back. My accounts are mine. My office has my desk in it again. Beaumont Home Health celebrated 35 years in operation last spring, and I stood at a dinner in Hamilton with 240 people who kept showing up, and I thought about my husband, and I thought about that kitchen table, and I did not think about my daughter at all. My son flew in for the dinner. He sat beside me, and at one point he leaned over and said quietly that he was proud of me. I told him I wasn't sure pride was the right word for surviving something that shouldn't have happened. He thought about that and said maybe resilience was better. I told him I'd accept resilience. I am 68 years old. I run my company. I have learned things about the Substitute Decisions Act in Ontario that I wish I'd never had to learn, and I have spoken to 2 different advocacy groups about changes that need to be made to protect people, particularly older women, particularly women in business, from having those provisions used against them by the people closest to them. The system has gaps. Bernard Lacroix found them, and I spent 14 months crawling out of one. If you're watching this and something about it feels familiar, if there's someone in your life asking questions about your finances that feel like inventory instead of concern, please talk to a lawyer before anything is filed, not after. before, because the hardest part of what happened to me wasn't the courtroom. It was the 8 months I spent watching someone else sit at my desk and tell my employees what to do, while I had no legal ground to stand on and a weekly grocery allowance that was supposed to make me feel taken care of. I know what I built. I knew it then and I know it now, and in the end, that knowing was the only thing no one could freeze. I still think about that weekly allowance. $300. My daughter would transfer it on Mondays, and I'd stand in Fortino's deciding between the good olive oil and the store brand, knowing I had a company worth millions sitting frozen behind a court order with her name on it. There's a particular kind of humiliation in that. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and grinding, like a stone in your shoe you're not allowed to remove. What I've come to understand is that what happened to me wasn't really about money, even though money was the instrument. It was about someone deciding that my age, my directness, my refusal to slow down, that those things made me a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Curtis saw a balance sheet. My daughter, somewhere along the way, started seeing one too. That's the part I sit with most. Not the fraud, not the court, not even Lacroix and his emails. The part where my daughter looked at me and saw an asset to be transferred rather than a mother who had given her every opportunity she'd ever had. Actions have weight. That's not a religious idea. It's just something I've observed in 68 years of being alive and paying attention. Curtis spent years constructing a scheme that required dishonesty at every single layer. A dishonest affidavit, a dishonest assessor, a dishonest lawyer, a financial advisor with a proposal drafted before the ink was dry on any concern about my health. All of that dishonesty had to be maintained simultaneously by multiple people over a long period of time. And every single thread of it eventually pulled loose, because that's what happens when you build something on a foundation of lies. You can't reinforce one wall without cracking another. What protected me? What actually protected me was that I had spent 34 years doing the opposite. My accountant had been with me since 1994 because I had always been straight with him. My operations manager stayed loyal through 8 months of a situation that could have cost her her job because the relationship we'd built was real. Paula was able to build a case because there was a true record to uncover. Integrity isn't a virtue you perform, it's a structure you build, quietly, over time. When everything else was frozen, that structure held. And then there's the matter of not giving up when giving up would have been so much easier. I want to be honest about that too. There were mornings in those 8 months when I drove to my office and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I could make myself go in, because I knew my desk had been moved and my name had been quietly replaced on the internal org chart. I went in anyway. I kept the notebook. I kept the records. I kept showing up to Paula's office with questions and documents and a clear memory of every conversation I'd had about my own business for 3 decades. That stubbornness, which my daughter once called a flaw, turned out to be the most useful thing I owned. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy. I'm telling it because I think a lot of people watching this know what it feels like to be underestimated by someone who was supposed to be in your corner. And I want them to know that being underestimated is only the end of the story if you let someone else write it. I know what I built. I knew it in that Fortino's parking lot, and I know it now.